Hey wrestling fans, thanks for all the positive feedback on this channel. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. My current stats show that 70% of viewers are not subscribed. It costs nothing, yet it really helps this little channel grow, as they say. So grab that tag rope for me. Okay, on to the chapter. Chapter 7, Keeping IT Real. When I got home, everyone was busy planning Ellie and Jim's wedding. Hart House had never looked so grand as it did on their wedding day. The chandeliers were polished and shone so brightly that you could see their glow all the way from the highway. Outside, snow hid the skeletons of the dead Cadillacs. Inside, logs crackled in the fireplaces, a teenage musician strummed her acoustic guitar, a hired hand in a tuxedo tended bar, and the dining room table was piled high with hors d'oeuvres. Owen entertained everyone, sprawled on the carpet in the living room, pitting Heathcliff the cat against his arch-nemesis, a stuffed monkey. The three of them put on a fine show, reversing in and out of holds, with Heathcliff's tail pounding on the rug as he tried to think up a counter-move. At last Stu escorted Ellie down the main stairs, and she looked resplendent. When the Reverend asked whether there was anybody who objected to the marriage, none of us were going to pipe up. We thought Jim was a perfect match for Ellie, as he was the only man we knew with a personality just as combustible as hers. But Shep, our old, half-blind bearded collie, barked frantically, and everyone laughed. Maybe Shep knew something we didn't. The whole time I'd been gone, business had been horrible. Art Nelson from Amarillo had been doing the booking, and the most boring wrestler on the planet, a big, slow, and arrogant old-timer named Larry Lane, was headlining. They were soon unceremoniously ushered out of the territory. By a process of elimination, I ended up the booker again. Keith and Bruce had gone back to school to get teaching degrees and could only work for the promotion on the weekends. I took it as a personal challenge to get my dad's business back on its feet. Wayne and I worked together on the road, and Ross and my mom ran the office. Helen actually seemed to have built up a tolerance for the business, and was often in the best of moods, fascinated by the day-to-day mishaps and funny stories I loved to tell her. We knew who was coming in and who was going out, and I'd sit with Ross and Stu and book 3 weeks in advance. It felt like we got the territory organized for the very first time. Dynamite was back for a little bit. In Japan he'd shaved his head and built himself an even more chiseled physique. I thought he looked like Pee Wee Herman with muscles. The original British punk had taken Japan by storm, but he wasn't going to be around much for the next while, having been booked for several tours in Japan. Stu had grown extremely fond of Tom, and gave him all the leeway he needed to work in Japan, and Tom repaid him by working harder than anyone else when he was in Calgary. I also couldn't help but notice that Tom was relying heavily on steroids, taking a lot of pills and polishing off a case of beer a night, but in the ring he was magnificent. Ross frantically searched for talent anywhere and managed to book Steve Wright, a thin, balding English wrestler who had a reputation as a shooter. He'd been taught by Ted Betley, who'd also taught Tom, and we hoped that Wright might be the second coming of the Dynamite Kid. When Tom went to England to work a few shows before heading off to Japan for another 3-week tour, he helped us out by booking Giant Haystacks for us, whose real name was Martin Ruane. The 7-foot, 550-pound behemoth, billed as England's version of Andre the Giant, was due to arrive in February, along with Wright. I was back in Regina again for the first time at the end of the first week of January 1980. The fans seemed to have missed me, and I realized that I had missed them too. The show was over, and I was zipping up my bag when Gil, the old security guard, leaned his head in the dressing room to tell me Julie was waiting for me. My first reaction was to sneak off. She and her sister had stayed on at my house when I'd left for Hawaii, but they went back to Regina after only a week, and I hadn't heard from her since. After all the girls in Atlanta, I couldn't see that Julie and I had much of a future, so I decided to tell her to her face that it was over. The arena was completely empty, and most of the lights were turned off. Julie was sitting on the ring apron. She smiled at me, and I found myself thinking that I didn't need to make any rash decisions. So, did you want to see me still, or are we done? Someone leaned on the horn of the van to hurry me up. If you want to pick up where we left off, we can, I said. But I have to go. We'll be staying over next week. We can talk better then. We did. She told me her life story and I told her mine. Like a mafia man, I told her to never ask me questions about the business. It was easier for me not to explain and better for her not to know. The territory was slowly improving. Keith and I held on to the tag belts. Leo Burke, a respected veteran in his early 30s, was our North American champion, and we'd turned our referee, Sandy Scott, into a great heel, which worked really well because the fans could be easily encouraged to hate a ref. Like a snide headmaster who relished his authority, Sandy was never wrong, even when he was. He never saw the obvious, Yet he was a stickler for the slightest infraction. He'd level fines and threaten suspensions, pursing his lips and wagging his finger in your face. The fans grew to totally despise him. Was Sandy on the take, they'd speculate, or was he just a horse's ass? Any reaction from the fans was a good reaction. And our two British wrestlers arrived. Steve Wright did have a repertoire of flips and rolls, but unfortunately he was no Dynamite. Giant Haystacks was a hairy beast, grizzled and ruddy, a grump with a short fuse and a sharp wit. He'd been gawked at his whole life, and he was sick of it. I changed his name to the Loch Ness Monster, and we started to build him. He didn't do much in the ring, but he was hard to take off his feet, and when he laid out one of the Japanese wrestlers with a massive belly flop, the crowd gasped. One of the cardinal rules for a booker is never to book yourself on top, but we needed someone to pit against Leo Burke for the North American belt. It was me or nobody. Leo was ruggedly handsome in a Burt Reynolds kind of way, and the grin on his face told me he was looking forward to working with me. In our first match I listened to every word he said. Leo Burke was a wrestler who could elevate me from being a good worker to a great one. We went a full hour, and we both got a bit of a scare when I accidentally almost put him to sleep for real. Sue was all smiles when I came back to the dressing room. A sweat-drenched Leo gave me a happy hug and said, "Beautiful." It was beautiful. A couple of days before Valentine's Day, I climbed into the van heading for Regina carrying a 5-foot-tall pink panther, which I set on top of all the bags so it wouldn't get dirty. The boys ribbed me about it all the way across the prairies. Once the matches were on, Julie and I went out back. I'd wanted to give her a better gift, but she really loved it. At the end of the night when the van pulled away, I had a pang in my heart as she disappeared in my rearview mirror, waving goodbye, holding the big toy like a little girl. The following Friday in Calgary, I thought Leo was kidding when he said, "Get your second wind, kid. The fans will never expect us to go an hour again." At the 52-minute mark the fans were standing on the seats cheering us on, the veteran and the youngster in a scientific struggle. The waltz was about over when I slipped on Ernie Ladd's proverbial banana peel. Leo caught me out of nowhere in his finishing move, the sleeper. I slowly sank to my knees and faded into black. The drama was endearing to both the young fans and the old-timers. Hearts didn't lose, and when I did it gave me all the credibility in the world. Meanwhile, Tom had injured his knee in Japan and had come home to heal. When he was working again, I naturally booked him against Steve Wright, thinking the fans would love it, though outside of the ring there was a noticeable coolness between them. Tom seemed more than a little nervous about working with him. Apparently, when Tom was a kid, Steve had made a steady habit of stretching and hurting him. I wasn't sure if Tom was afraid that Steve would mop the floor with him or of what he would do to Steve if he tried. Maybe his biggest fear was of the disappointment that Ted Bentley would feel either way. Regardless, we needed the match. But it ended up being a disaster. For most of it, Steve hooked into Dynamite while he was on all fours. Tom looked bored and made no attempt to even fight back. It was easy to see the immense pleasure Steve took in hurting Tom. At one point he applied a surfboard, a move that consisted of him standing on the back of Tom's knees and hooking his legs, then grabbing Tom's wrists, falling onto his own back and hoisting Tom up in an arch above him. Steve may just as well have taken a sledgehammer to Tom's just healed knee. Stu angrily approached the apron, pounding his hands on the mat. "I'm paying you to work, not to shoot, damn it." We'd been building Loch Ness into a monster heel. He'd had nothing but short, decisive wins and was now beating two wrestlers at a time in handicap matches. He was over with the fans, but not with the wrestlers. A couple of French Canadians griped that they didn't want to work with him because he was too stiff, too clumsy, and he smelled bad. I tried to reason with them, explaining that we were short on talent and we'd paid a lot to bring him in, but then had no choice but to tell them if they didn't work with him, they could finish up. I gambled that a hard line would put an end to their complaints. We couldn't afford to lose them either, and it did. Loch Ness was stiff, and he did smell a bit ripe, but it didn't make things any easier when he was constantly beamed with gum wrappers and bottle caps by the wrestlers seated behind him on the long rides. He'd sit there steaming mad, smoking his cigarettes right down to the filter. I felt like a school bus driver hopelessly trying to keep the kiddies in line. At one point Loch Ness finally snapped. "I'll kick the shit out of the whole lot of you," he threatened, and he turned, pointing his huge fat finger at everyone in the back row. The Cuban, who hadn't done anything, quickly had his knife out and ordered the van to a stop. In the nick of time, Loch Ness apologized to the Cuban, and that was the end of it. Then Big Jim came back, billed as the strongest lineman in the NFL. I had kept Loch Ness invincible, until Jim knocked him flat on his ass with some football tackles. It blew the roof off the pavilion. On the way to Regina, one night at the beginning of March, the wind was sharp as a knife, and the temperature had fallen to 40 below. We sputtered to a stop in the middle of nowhere, with a frozen gas line. I got out and stood in the cold, flagging down cars and trucks. As Wayne got a ride to a gas station to get some line to eat chair, I managed to find volunteers to take every wrestler into town but Loch Ness. I could see he was starting to panic, thinking I would leave him on his own to freeze to death. So I stayed, a captain going down with his ship, no heat, no light, waiting for rescue. To take our minds off the cold, I told him a story about the world-famous McGuire twins, more than 700 pounds each, who'd come up on Stampede Week a few years back. As the story goes, it was a hot summer morning, just after sunrise, when the school bus my dad rented broke down. All the wrestlers climbed out, including the midgets, and pushed the bus down the highway while the driver popped the clutch trying to get the engine to catch. All except Billy and Benny McGuire, who, at their size, didn't have the stamina for bus pushing. They were left standing at the side of the road with "Don't worry, we'll be back for you." The other wrestlers pushed the bus all the way to a truck stop 5 miles up the road and then went into the cafe for coffee while the mechanic sorted out the problem. At that hour, the long-distance truckers were just coming off overnight hauls. One by one they pulled into the truck stop, shaking their heads. "You're not going to believe what I saw back there on the road." It must have been an eyeful to come upon this massive blob of humanity standing there in the heat, and then a quarter mile down the road, an identical blob. My breath froze in the air as I said, "That's one good thing. At least we don't have to stand in the hot sun." And Loch Ness laughed. He said, "Bret, I just want you to know I appreciate how you stood up for me with those French lads. I won't forget it." Then a car pulled up and Wayne jumped out, and a few minutes later we took off through the snow, just in time to make the show. That night, just before the van left Regina for the 9-hour drive to Billings, Tully gave me a kiss goodbye. Tom watched from the van window, and after we drove off, he asked, "What's with that?" I braced myself for the inevitable off-color remark, but when it didn't come, I told him the truth, that Julie and I sort of hit it off. "I like her a lot, Tom." I was surprised to hear him say, "You know what you mean. I wish I could find a girl like that." In Billings, I'd be working with Harley Race, setting him up to defend his world heavyweight title against Leo throughout the territory when we did the loop in the coming week. Little did I know at the time that this would be the one and only time I'd ever wrestle for the NWA World Heavyweight title. For some reason it was assumed I'd go an hour with him, but the question was whether I could, after a 500-mile drive. When Harley and I locked eyes in the dressing room, I could see he was just as beat as I was. "Don't tell me we're going for a fucking hour?" I smiled and said, "Harley, it's whatever you want." He wanted 10 minutes, which was fine with me. By Friday night of that circuit, the pavilion was completely sold out. Everyone wanted to watch Harley successfully defend his title. Business had been steadily climbing. To capitalize on Loch Ness's last 2 weeks, Keith and I dropped the tag straps to him and Dynamite. For the finish, Sandy Scott restrained Keith as Dynamite dove like a bird across the ring wearing a rugby helmet, no doubt filled with titanium steel, and crashed head-to-head with me. I lay there flat on the mat watching as Loch Ness collapsed on top of me like a house. Not being able to breathe, I felt a sense of panic, and the thought crossed my mind that this is what the French boys had been complaining about. After what seemed like an eternity, Sandy dove down to the mat and counted 1, 2, 3. The next week the pavilion thundered as Keith and I battered Loch Ness with a barrage of lefts and rights until he flopped into his corner. I headed back to Dynamite in the far corner just as Loch Ness recovered enough to charge across the ring like a runaway train. Tom told me the exact second to move, and Loch Ness squashed him like a grape. The crowd became unglued. Keith fell in on all fours behind Loch Ness and I delivered a nice high drop kick to his chest. Loch Ness reeled, his arms flailing like giant windmills. I hit him with another drop kick and he toppled backwards over Keith, with me diving on top for the pin. Afterwards, in the dressing room, it was all hugs and handshakes. Loch Ness had worked hard and had a huge grin on his face. Even Tom was pleased. The next week, with Loch Ness and Wright gone, Stu had a cavalry of American wrestlers arriving, including Kasavubu, the Ugandan giant. He suffered from diabetes and kidney disease, and every few days he needed to hook himself up to a dialysis machine. Sometimes he was very tired, but he kept it to himself and never complained. He would often relieve Wayne or me for a spell at the wheel, pop in a Marvin Gaye tape, and sing softly in perfect harmony. When Koss was with us, he made a habit of looking after JR. He couldn't stop him from taking the odd nip, but he kept JR busy playing cribbage and diverted him with bad jokes, making sure he wasn't quite so drunk every night come match time. The spring snow was replaced by rain. One night, as the Wipers kept time with a Motown beat, Wayne fell into a conversation with the midget wrestler Cowboy Lang. Cowboy could do great drop kicks and all the other moves just like the big guys, but midgets had always been slapstick. Cowboy said, "We were gonna do a title change, but we couldn't find a promoter who would let us do it. I asked him if there was a belt and he told me Little Tokyo had it in his bag. Wayne and Koss kidded him that maybe Stu would let them switch the title. Cowboy's eyes grew wide when I agreed to actually take it up with Stu. That Friday night as I drove to the pavilion, I thought about how happy Cowboy would be, winning that tiny World Midget Championship belt. I stopped and bought a couple of bottles of cheap champagne. When he won, all the boys charged into the ring and showered Cowboy with it. He cried during his interview with Ed Whalen, and he was so ecstatic that he poured champagne over his own head. And there had to be at least one fan who went home thinking, wow, the World Midget title changed hands tonight? Each night I wrote out detailed accounts of every match in a small orange notebook. I thought it would be invaluable to be able to look up what worked, what didn't, and why, and especially to keep a record to make sure I didn't repeat the same outcomes every week. I was really beginning to understand how to structure a card. Never have 2 disqualifications back-to-back. Keep the broadways, or draws, to a minimum. Go easy on the gimmicks. Use juice only when necessary. Not too many low blows. Never let the fans guess the outcome. Keep it real. Book at least 3 weeks in advance. Above all, make sure nobody gets hurt for real. The territory was now filled with a nice mix of old-timers and rookies who enjoyed bringing out the best in one another. Because there wasn't much difference in pay between top and bottom, egos were kept in check, and the dressing room was pretty relaxed. I never asked anyone to do what I wouldn't do myself. I worked hard every night and was honest and direct, and the wrestlers treated me the same. There were pitfalls to booking, especially as the son of the promoter. People would often put down to ego moves that were really simply protecting Stu's business. It was Leo who came to me and told me I needed to take the North American heavyweight title from him, insisting it was in Stu's best interest. The Edmonton fans were on the edge of their seats for the whole match. At the 40-minute mark, I had Leo in a headlock. He called for a reverse abdominal stretch and fired me hard into the ropes. As I came back at him, he threw his arm up to get around me, and elbowed me squarely at the base of my nose. I fell flat on the canvas and rolled slowly over on my stomach, blood flooding from both nostrils. Leo rolled me back and said, "Don't move," and dropped a knee into my face. The beauty of a really great pro like Leo was that all I felt was the faintest touch, and I sold the hell out of it. At the sight of blood in a babyface match, the crowd rallied behind me. Leo worked my nose for the rest of the match, but never once did he hurt me. When the time was right, he called for the finish. I reversed him into the ropes and he dove over top of me attempting a simple sunset flip, but I fought off falling backward and dropped to my knees. I hooked his legs and there was no escape. What a beautiful finish. One that I would keep in the back of my mind forever for something special. In the dressing room afterwards, I looked in the mirror and saw that my top lip was detached from my mouth on the inside. I was worried that I'd lose my front teeth. The commission doctor was useless. He was a little old German guy who picked his nose until his fingernails were caked with blood, and yet he thought wrestlers were uncouth. All he ever did was take your blood pressure to make sure you were fit enough to get in the ring. How you came out of the ring was no concern of his. At the show in Calgary the following Friday, my eyes were circled with black rings and my lips and nose were puffed out, giving me the profile of a B-52 bomber. It hurt like hell. I was supposed to have a match with a guy I'd never met. When I first looked at Duke Myers, from Portland, he struck me as a big Elmer Fudd, sitting there smoking a cigarette, wearing some old beat-up white boots and a pair of blue trunks that looked like old underwear. He had a beer belly and a head like a watermelon. When I asked him how long he'd been working, he confessed that he'd recently got out of prison. As it turned out, he was a good worker, with just a bit of ring rust, and we did just fine. I had him in an abdominal stretch, with Sandy Scott ready to ring the bell when, right on cue, Koss charged in wearing his street clothes, viciously attacking me and slamming me to the mat. He hit the ropes to deliver his flying elbow drop, but his foot caught in his pant cuff and he crashed down, right on top of my face. By the time I was helped back to the dressing room, there was Koss hanging his head while Stu berated him in front of all the boys for not being careful enough. In Koss's defense, I said it was an accident. Stu left it at that. Koss felt awful. A few days later he confided to me that he was having a hard time working, his kidneys were getting worse and he might need to return home soon for a transplant. I was worried about him. When the van pulled up to the back of the building in Regina, I noticed that Julie's sister, Michelle, was working security for Gil. She was tall and looked way too appealing for her age. She wasn't even 18 yet, as she opened the big sliding doors at the back and waved us in. Tom mumbled, "I'd shag that." With Tom, it was easier to let remarks like that pass. Julie and I were at the point where we couldn't stand seeing each other only once a week, and I'd just talked her into moving in with me. I had no idea whether it would last a day, a week or forever. Living with me in my little house in Ramsey didn't mean she'd see me all that much more, when you got right down to it. And Stu had just booked Keith and me over to Japan. I may have been doing well by the family business, but Stu would sacrifice his own interests if there was a chance for his sons to earn more money and make their mark. I never met a wrestler who didn't believe that the big break was just around the corner, even though for most of us that break would never come. I believed that my best chance was waiting for me in Japan, where it didn't matter how good you were on the mic. And I guess I hoped that Julie would be able to handle my being gone so much.